I'm Reed Kane, and this is the Socialist Legacy. Today I will be giving the first in a series of lectures I'm delivering alongside a reading group that I will be leading over the next few months for the Campaign for a Socialist Party. The subject of the reading group being, what is a socialist party? The Campaign for a Socialist Party is a project that is probably best described by reading its points of agreement, and I'm going to begin the lecture with that. If you're interested in learning more about the campaign or have any questions, you can contact us at campaignforasocialistparty@gmail.com. The points of agreement are as follows. 1. We are exploring interest in starting a mass socialist party in the United States. 2. Mass means more than a sect, small or large. Socialist means more than merely democratic or liberal. Political means going beyond social and economic actions, including but not primarily or limited to holding political office. Party means more than a movement or organization. 3. This will be an unprecedented undertaking, and in many respects, the first real political party in the United States. The only precedents are the old pre-World War I Socialist Party of America, and before that, the Republican Party of the mid-19th century. 4. We want to include as much of the present avowed left as possible, from liberals to anarchists. We find the existing left to consist of talented organizers and thinkers, but they need a new and different context to be effective. Now they are condemned to ineffectiveness, or to more or less support the Democrats. 5. We are looking ahead to a decades-long, painstaking, and patient but deliberate and serious process. The building of a mass socialist political party will fundamentally alter the political, but also the social landscape in the United States and internationally, globally. 6. The aim is to take governing power in the United States. This does not preclude, and indeed aims at doing so, in direct political cooperation with similar parties taking power in other countries. 7. Now, in 2016, is a good time to begin this project because of the disarray of the existing parties, as well as of society. There is a window of opportunity with a new generation to embark on a political task and possibility that has been avoided since the 1960s New Left, and also avoided since the 1930s Old Left, both of which were conditioned and distorted by the gravitational attraction of the Democratic Party, as well as the dynamics of anti-communism and the Cold War. We are past this now, and so can proceed to build socialist politics free of such pressures. 8. The Sanders campaign has been a distraction from this task because it is a desperate attempt to reform the Democrats, which will not happen, and even if it did, would not lead to socialism in any way. 9. All existing left social, economic, civic, legal, and political activism of all kinds should be conducted under the political banner of the struggle for socialism. We need to make all these disparate struggles coherent for any of them to be effective. Such struggles should take place in and through a socialist party. 10. In the immediate future, the goal is to reconfigure U.S. politics in terms amenable to a socialist left. The Republicans should be the capitalist party. The Democrats should be the party of middle-class democracy. A socialist party should be for the working class in its struggle for socialism. 11. Socialism will be the realization of the social potential made possible but held back by capitalism. We need a party to pursue the politics of this task. Join us. That was written February 28th, 2016, at the beginning of the campaign. And the campaign has existed since then, although the last 4 or 5 years since it was started were impeded in many ways by the Trump presidency, or really more accurately by the reaction to the Trump presidency on the left, which was really a distraction from the sort of work we were hoping to do. Now, with Trump out of office and the left sort of disoriented by its supposed victory with Biden's election, poses a potential opportunity to do something that hasn't been possible since we began this campaign. So we are, among other things, undertaking this reading group, which we did before in a different version a few years ago, in a few different places. This is going to be a repetition but slightly different version of that reading group, focusing primarily on the works of Karl Kautsky, who was the chief theoretician of the Second International, the social democratic parties of the Second International, and the theoretical inheritor of the legacy of Marx and Engels after Engels passed away. So I'm going to deliver this first lecture, and I'm going to build initially off of those points of agreement, which is why I read them. So the purpose of this reading group is to clarify questions that those points of agreement raise, and in doing so, to hopefully clarify the aims and intentions of this project, both for people that have already committed themselves to it and for people that are potentially interested, that are considering it, that might be considering participating in it, but are not at this point 100% convinced of the goal that we're setting ourselves with it. Above all, the question to be clarified, and hence the titular question of the reading group itself, is what is a socialist party? And relatedly, why are we, or why should anyone be interested in building a socialist party? Further questions that I hope to specify, or that I hope we can specify through these readings, through these lectures, and through discussions of that material, include: what does it mean to be a mass party, to be more than a sect, small or large? What does it mean to be a socialist party, that is more than merely democratic or liberal? What is a political party, in the sense of going beyond social and economic actions, and including but not primarily or limited to holding political office? And how does a party amount to more than a movement or organization? Furthermore, how would a socialist party relate to social and economic actions and to political action? How would a socialist party relate to a socialist movement, to a labor movement, or to other movements? How would it relate to other organizations? Why is the existing left condemned to ineffectiveness, or to more or less support the Democrats? How would the new and different context of a socialist party change that? What would be specifically new and different about it in that sense? How will the building of a mass socialist party, political party, fundamentally alter the political and social landscape of the US and internationally? Why is the aim to take governing power in the United States in direct political cooperation with similar parties in other countries? Why is that necessary and desirable? How would it be accomplished? What would it mean, and what would it require to do so? Why couldn't the attempt of the Sanders campaign succeed? And why can't those inspired by it, inspired to reform the Democrats, for example, DSA, why can't they succeed? And if they could succeed, presumably, or hypothetically, if they could succeed, why couldn't that lead to socialism? How would conducting social, economic, civic, legal, and political activism under the political banner of the struggle for socialism, in and through a socialist party, make these disparate struggles coherent and hence effective? How would conducting activism under these auspices differ from what is presently being done? Why should the Republicans be the capitalist party and the Democrats the party of middle-class democracy? And for that matter, what is middle-class democracy, and how is that different from socialism? Why would such a reconfiguration of the mainstream of politics in the United States be amenable to a socialist left? How does this differ from what these parties currently represent? How would or could building a socialist party reconfigure the capitalist parties in this way? What does it mean for a socialist party to be for the working class, to be the working class party? What is the social potential that is made possible but held back by capitalism? What is meant by socialism in this sense? And why do we need a party to pursue the politics of this task? And there are further questions that these points of agreement raise that we won't necessarily be delving into in detail in this reading group, but that we may touch upon, and I wanted to just kind of present the full range of those questions so that if they do come up, say, in the discussion, if not necessarily in the lectures or the readings themselves, we're at least kind of keeping an eye out for them and thinking about them. And those questions include, for example, why would such a socialist party be the first real political party in the United States? In what sense was the Republican Party of the mid-19th century a precedent for it? How was the old pre-World War I Socialist Party of America a precedent? This question in particular we will be approaching somewhat indirectly by looking at the socialist politics of Second International Social Democracy, the social democratic parties, the Socialist Party of America being one of those parties, primarily through the writings of Karl Kautsky, as I already mentioned. We won't be looking much at the American experience in particular, that is the way in which Kautsky's ideas and by way of Kautsky, the ideas of Marx and Engels, were interpreted and applied in the unique American context as compared to, say, in Germany or France or Russia or England. The exception being in the first session, the session for which this lecture is being delivered, and briefly in the fourth session, in which both in this first session and the fourth, we will be looking at some writings by Eugene Debs, who was the leader of the Socialist Party of America. And we'll be doing that as a way of kind of opening up some of the guiding questions that we're going to be looking into the Kautsky and other readings for some more depth and more specificity. Why did the Socialist Party of America and the parties of the Second International more generally fail? What about the communist parties that sought to overcome that failure? Why are they not a worthy president? How did they differ from the Second International parties? And why did they fail as well? These are all more questions that we won't be addressing directly, but that may, at least in some way, come up or at least be indicated. And finally, why was the political task and possibility of building a socialist party avoided since the 1960s New Left, and also avoided since the 1930s Old Left? Why were the left politics of those and subsequent generations conditioned and distorted by the gravitational attraction of the Democratic Party? The purpose of this course is not to answer these questions in a definitive way. It is certainly not for me to provide you these answers. I certainly don't have the answers myself. At least nothing like definitive answers. In these lectures, my goal is rather to set up the readings in relation to these questions, to explain the rationale behind the selection of these readings, the context within which they were originally written, and to draw out some basic points to consider when reading and discussing them. Yet even in reading and discussing these texts, we should only expect to glean provisional answers at best, and really, to deepen these questions and discover further questions to be pursued. To really answer these questions requires the practical work of trying to build the kind of party we suspect is possible and necessary, work which this history can guide, but only up to a point. The experience of Second International social democracy cannot be mechanically reproduced today. Kautsky, Debs, Liebknecht, Lenin, Hal Draper, Marx, and Engels do not provide us with a model that simply needs to be implemented. They didn't even do that or have that in their own moment. And our moment is, however, similar and continuous with theirs in some respects, clearly separated by massive differences, resulting from more than a century of intervening history. It would be presumptuous to consider that history to have been progressive, in the sense that the example of the Second International is no longer relevant, that we are beyond the need for what it tried to do. At least this project is born of the hypothesis that something like that is still needed, and that the changes that occurred over the last century did not solve the problems to which the Second International was responding, but rather further complicated them, piling on top of those problems further problems that the old Marxists did not themselves face, and hence that they didn't have to try to solve. This has, moreover, made those old problems more obscure, more difficult to see, more difficult to recognize as the same old problems with which the old socialist parties struggled, and hence has made the old attempt to solve the problem less obviously relevant, or even apparently obsolete and antiquated. This leaves aside the deeper question posed by the failure of that attempt, namely, whether it was even adequate in its moment, or whether its failure demonstrated basic errors in the judgment of those who ventured the attempt. These are questions that go beyond the scope of this course, and that it would perhaps be worthwhile to pursue in further educational endeavors building upon this one. But I do think we should at least keep these questions in mind when we are reading these texts and discussing them. We can only mislead ourselves and thereby mislead others, if we're even able to lead anyone at all, if we deny that these questions exist or pretend they've already found satisfactory answers. This project is an experiment, and as such, the result is uncertain. It may fail, or it may succeed in ways we do not expect. Whatever the result, we must be prepared to learn from what we do, and to build upon what we learn. And that is impossible if we begin with the belief that we already know what must be done and how to do it. The purpose of reading and discussing these texts is rather to flesh out our hypothesis, to specify and deepen the questions we want to answer, by bringing the lessons of previous attempts, arguably the most profound and insightful, if ultimately inadequate, attempts, to bear. The core texts of this course are the three major works by Karl Kautsky: The Class Struggle, The Social Revolution, and The Road to Power. Kautsky was a student of Marx and Engels, and these works condense the lessons he learned from them, and from the efforts of their followers in the Second International that were informed by those lessons. So, a few words about Marx and Engels. Marx and Engels came of age as good liberal Democrats at the end of the period of liberal and democratic revolutions that gave birth to the modern world, beginning with the English Revolution in the 17th century and the Age of Enlightenment that followed, continuing and escalating with the American Revolution, itself provoking the French Revolution, and culminating in Napoleon's empire, which spread the results of the revolution throughout Europe. Above all, the principle of bourgeois society, that all men should be free to enjoy the fruits of their own labor and to exchange the products of their labor with each other, and that the aristocracy and the church should no longer impede, interfere with, or leech off of the free labor of society. Napoleon was defeated, and the old order was restored, but in a clearly superficial and unstable manner, as the new social principle, emancipated labor as the new basis of society, was not and could not be undone. It was evident to men of the people, like Marx and Engels, that the revolution was not over, and that it would come back again and complete the process that had been temporarily interrupted. Yet it was also evident that something new and different was occurring, distinguishing the 19th century from the 17th and 18th, the Industrial Revolution. The free association of labor was being transformed by the introduction of large-scale machinery into the production process. Workers who once aspired to independent self-sufficiency on the basis of their labor were increasingly faced with no alternative but to seek employment from owners of massive accumulations of wealth, capital, in the form of machinery, and thus to become dependent on and subservient to what appeared to be a newly emerging ruling class of capitalists who were taking the place of the old aristocracy. This process, which Debs describes in his speech, Competition versus Cooperation, one of the readings for this session, was something Marx and Engels witnessed unfolding firsthand as they came of age. They were thus compelled to recognize that the liberal democratic revolutionary principles they sought to uphold and advance against the restoration of the old ruling classes were confronting a new problem, developing out of the new bourgeois society of free labor itself. Hence, this revolution could not simply continue the same course it had taken in the previous centuries. It would also have to resolve this new problem, the problem that the society of free labor was undermining itself with the rise of large-scale industry, of production on the basis of machinery, of capital. Marx and Engels witnessed the working classes that confronted this problem directly in France, Belgium, and above all, England, trying to grapple with it by renewing the struggle for democracy, and through other forms of organization and action in society, such as trade unions and cooperatives. They also witnessed the utopian socialists, visionaries who recognized the ongoing changes as a crisis, pointing toward the possibility and necessity of transforming social life in a fundamental way, offering their own visions of a new social order as solutions to the crisis, and gaining followers who sought to implement those visions. Most significantly, they witnessed the working class movement taking up and transforming the ideas of the socialists in an effort to clarify for themselves the problem they were confronting. Their social and political action was failing to get traction on this problem within the framework of society as it existed. Through the ideas of the socialists, they began to grasp the need for a more profound transformation of society to resolve the problem. Marx and Engels sought to help the working class socialist movement to clarify for itself what made this transformation necessary and how it might be brought about. They sought to transform the experience of this struggle, its failures and defeats, into a means of self-education, through which those undertaking the struggle could learn and develop beyond the old mistakes and ultimately reach their goal. The basic lesson they distilled from this history was that the owners of capital and those who defended their social power obstructed the further progress of the revolution, as they benefited, or at least believed they benefited, from the preservation of society as it was, in which the majority of people as workers were dependent upon and subservient to the capitalists. For the revolution to continue to progress, the workers, those who did not own capital, would have to take power into their own hands, as only they would be able to recognize the need for society to progress beyond this impasse represented by the development of the machines, and thereby realize the potential freedom this development occasioned. Not merely the freedom of labor, the bourgeois freedom of labor in society, but freedom from labor and beyond labor. For Marx and Engels, the Socialist Party embodied this developing consciousness of the class struggle of the industrial working class against the emerging capitalist class. It embodied the lessons learned through the history of this struggle, and specifically the fundamental lesson that if the working class did not take political power, their efforts to overcome the problem underlying their discontents would continue to fail. It is this critical clarification of socialism, specifically the socialism taken up by the industrial working class in its struggle, as distilling the lessons learned through this struggle, that was the fundamental contribution of Marx and Engels, and that would become known as Marxism, or scientific socialism. Marx summarized these lessons in the preamble he wrote for the program of the French Workers' Party, or Parti ouvrière, and this is another one of the readings for this session. He writes that the emancipation of the productive class is that of all human beings, without distinction of sex or race, that the producers can be free only when they are in possession of the means of production, that there are only two forms under which the means of production can belong to them. One, the individual form, which has never existed in a general state, and which is increasingly eliminated by industrial progress. Or two, the collective form, the material and intellectual elements of which are constituted by the very development of capitalist society. That this collective appropriation can arise only from the revolutionary action of the productive class, or proletariat, organized in a distinct political party. That such an organization must be pursued by all the means the proletariat has at its disposal, including universal suffrage, which will thus be transformed from the instrument of deception that it has been until now into an instrument of emancipation. And that the aim of their efforts is the political and economic expropriation of the capitalist class and the return to community of all the means of production. It is this lesson that Debs explains in his speech, Competition versus Cooperation, the speech by which he announced the intentions of the newly formed Social Democratic Party of America, later renamed the Socialist Party of America, as its first presidential candidate. Debs himself had to learn this lesson the hard way, as he recounts in his article, How I Became a Socialist, the third reading for this session. His experience as a labor organizer, culminating in his founding of the American Railway Union and that organization's defeat and destruction in the Pullman strike, which landed Debs in prison, taught him the same lessons the workers in Europe had already learned decades before. While in prison, he read socialist literature in an effort to make sense of his experience, and he found the writings of Kautsky were so clear and conclusive that I readily grasped not merely his argument, but also caught the spirit of his socialist utterance, and I thank him and all who helped me out of darkness into light. These writings helped him recognize that the Pullman strike had been his first practical lesson in socialism, though he was wholly unaware at the time that it was called by that name. Hence, Debs and the remnants of the ARU were able to turn their defeat into a different kind of victory. Debs concludes, "The American Railway Union was defeated, but not conquered, overwhelmed, but not destroyed. It lives and pulsates in the socialist movement, and its defeat but blazed the way to economic freedom and hastened the dawn of human brotherhood." It was Kautsky's book, The Class Struggle, the reading for our second session, that helped Debs out of the darkness and into the light. As Kautsky wrote, and Debs read in the conclusion of that book. To give the class struggle of the proletariat the most effective form, this is the function of the Socialist Party. Now the proletariat has a goal towards which it is struggling, which it comes nearer to with every battle. Now all features of the class struggle have a meaning, even those that produce no immediate practical results. Every effort that preserves or increases the self-consciousness of the proletariat or its spirit of cooperation and discipline is worth the making. Many an apparent defeat is turned into a victory. Every unsuccessful strike, every labor law defeated, means a step toward the securing of a life worthy of human beings. Every political or industrial measure which has reference to the proletariat has a good effect. Whether it be friendly or unfriendly, matters not, so long as it tends to stir up the working class. From now on, the militant proletariat is no longer like an army fighting hard to defend positions already won. Now it must become clear to the dullest onlooker that it is an irresistible conqueror. There is obviously much more to discuss in Debs's speech. I've sought only to clarify where he learned what he says there, namely from the experience of the class struggles of the English, French, and German workers over the course of the 19th century, as digested and clarified by Marx and Engels, and transmitted by Kautsky. Debs touches on many of the questions I raised at the outset of this lecture, and which we will explore in more depth in the discussion. To conclude, I want to briefly outline the trajectory of this course and the readings we will be discussing. The next session, we will discuss Kautsky's The Class Struggle, which I've already introduced. And in my next lecture, I will provide more detailed background about that text and the political developments upon which it was based. That book expands on the history and the lessons learned from it that I just recounted in a very condensed form, and that Debs summarized more eloquently in his speech. For the third and fourth sessions, I've added a few readings that were not on the syllabus for the original version of this reading group 2 years ago. I've added these readings to help flesh out something with which Kautsky assumed his readers will be more or less familiar, but which cannot be taken for granted today: the Socialist Party as an actually existing organization in society, through which readers would be encountering his writings. Kautsky's writings are for members or potential members of this party, and are intended to clarify why it exists, why it does what it does, and what it is ultimately seeking to do. Of course, no such party exists today, and familiarity with the history of that party cannot be taken for granted. If anything, what can be taken for granted is that anything people today think they know about such a party is confused, if not outright incorrect, as the past century has deposited several layers of distortion over this history. It is beyond the scope of this reading group to address and work through the full extent of the distortion resulting from the 20th century. While I cannot expect participants in this course to simply set aside whatever preconceptions they have about this subject matter, and of course expect these to come up in our discussions, I figured I could at least help to displace these preconceptions by fleshing out what the party was and was not for Kautsky and his contemporaries. I intend to do this in part through these lectures, but wanted some grounding for that discussion in the readings themselves. The third session, which I've titled The Role of the Party, picks up where Kautsky leaves off at the end of the class struggle, namely with the role of the party. We'll be reading an essay by a British New Left dissident communist, Monty Johnstone, titled The Concept of the Party in Marx and Engels, which traces how they understood the role of the party over the course of their lives in relation to the unfolding history of the socialist movement in which they participated. We will also read a piece by Engels, The Tactics of Social Democracy, written in the final year of his life as a preface to Marx's 1850 study of the French Revolution of 1848, the class struggles in France, in which he, Engels, retrospectively recounts the development of the socialist movement from the standpoint of its culmination in Second International Social Democracy, especially the Social Democratic Party of Germany, of which Kautsky was the chief theoretician after Engels. In the fourth session, which I've titled Politics of Class Struggle, we'll address the question of what the party actually did, the nature of its political action, and how this was related to social action. We'll do so through a short reflection of Eugene Debs on the danger of electoral success for the Socialist Party and the role of electoral activity. Two pamphlets by Wilhelm Liebknecht, a student and follower of Marx and Engels, and founder of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, dealing with the role of political action within the parliamentary arena and in relation to other political parties, and how this related to other forms of social action. And a preface Lenin wrote to one of Liebknecht's pamphlets, elaborating on the significance of his political method. In the fifth and sixth sessions, we'll read Kautsky's The Social Revolution, dealing with the nature of socialist revolution and the role of the party within it, and The Road to Power, addressing how the party sought to conquer political power. In the seventh and final session, we'll read two articles written by Hal Draper, a third camp Trotskyist who became a mentor for the New Left, on the microsect, the degeneration of the socialist movement into ineffectual sects, the difference between sects and parties, the futility of trying to build a party by way of sectarian organization, and a potential road to building a socialist party that is not the road of the sect, which Draper gleans from his study of Marx and Engels in their engagement with the socialist movement, and of Lenin in the Russian social democratic movement, inspired, like Debs, by the example of German social democracy and the writings of Kautsky, as well as Marx and Engels. And so that concludes the first lecture for this reading group or course on what is a socialist party. These lectures will be posted every 2 weeks, as the discussion sessions will be every 2 weeks. And I invite any comments you might have in the comment section below, or if you want to contact me directly, you can reach me at contact@socialistlegacy.com. And I'm interested on your feedback, and if you're participating in the reading group, I look forward to discussing these texts with you. And just a final note, if you've been following the Socialist Legacy project thus far, I realize the activity on the YouTube channel has been less frequent, and that's because I'm sort of ramping up to the next phase of this project, in which I will be posting more regularly and posting more of a diversity of material. So look forward to that. I think within the next few weeks, you should be seeing some updates on that, and as well as further installments of my readings from the Julius Bronthal book, History of the International, which is probably worth checking out alongside this reading group, or subsequent to this reading group, if you are interested in the deeper history of the Socialist Party as a historical phenomenon. If you are interested in following along with this reading group, I will post the syllabus, a link to the syllabus of readings in the description below. So check that out, and otherwise I will talk to you soon, or otherwise hope to hear from you if you are interested and want to know more or participate. So thank you.